This podcast is brought to you by the American Enterprise Institute.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share.
Thanks for listening. Here's our show.
What in the hell's going on?
What the hell is going on?
What the hell is going on?
I don't know what the hell he's talking about.
You don't have to know what the hell is on it.
What the hell's the matter with these guys?
We don't know what's going on.
What the hell's going on?
Who in God's name knows what it's all about?
Hi, I'm Danielle Pletka.
And I'm Mark Thiessen.
Welcome to our podcast, What the Hell is Going On? Mark, what the hell this week?
Well, what the hell is going on? We're literally, as we release this, days away from a historic election, but we are going back in a time capsule 60 years, because before a historic election 60 years ago in 1964, Ronald Reagan gave a speech which became known as A Time for Choosing, and Reagan biographers is so influential that they just called it the speech. It's the speech that launched Ronald Reagan's political career. It's the speech that launched the modern conservative movement. It's the speech that cast him into the political stratosphere and put him on the path to win the White House 16 years later. He gave it in support of Barry Goldwater, who lost, but some have said, some historians have said that Goldwater actually won. He just won 16 years later when Ronald Reagan won the presidency. And so this is the speech that did that. And what we're going to do here is we've got Peter Schweizer, who is a eminent historian of Ronald Reagan, has written 2 great books on the Reagan presidency. And he's going to talk to us about the speech. And we're also going to talk about where Reaganism is today. Is this something that's in the past? Is this the future of the Republican Party? Can we bring it back? You and I are both Reaganites. What do you think, Danny?
Look, I have argued with you frequently on this podcast that I don't think that there's a great Ronald Reagan riding in on his horse as a knight in shining armor. But what I liked about this conversation is that we kind of didn't go to Reagan 2.0, but maybe Reagan 3.0. What are the ideas necessary? The reality, Mark, is that I think you and I make a mistake when we think about an individual, and this is one of my standard rants. We make a mistake when we think about the individual who's going to save us. I think the reality is it's the ideas that are going to save us, much as the ideas that were expressed in this amazing speech really shaped the philosophy of the Republican Party and of the Republican movement, even when they lost pretty damn ignominiously in 1964. And that's what's going to get us, that's what's going to move us forward.
And 1976.
And 2.
Yeah.
A few times since as well. But, we talk about, well, it's not Trump we need, it's this guy or that guy who's going to magically save us. And the right answer is actually we need to articulate the ideas that are going to take conservatism forward. It's not about winning a tactical victory tomorrow. It's about actually having a glide path towards a better country.
Well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to play you some excerpts from the speech. It was originally a half-hour speech on television, almost exactly, but we've taken some of the best elements of it in a shortened, condensed version. We're going to play that now, and then we're going to turn to our conversation with Peter Schweizer. So here is A Time for Choosing.
We're at war with the most dangerous enemy that has ever faced mankind in his long climb from the swamp to the stars. And it's been said if we lose that war, and in so doing lose this way of freedom of ours, history will record with the greatest astonishment that those who had the most to lose did the least to prevent its happening. Well, I think it's time we ask ourselves if we still know the freedoms that were intended for us by the founding fathers. Not too long ago, 2 friends of mine were talking to a Cuban refugee, a businessman who had escaped from Castro. And in the midst of his story, one of my friends turned to the other and said, "We don't know how lucky we are." And the Cuban stopped and said, "How lucky you are. I had some place to escape to." And in that sentence, he told us the entire story. If we lose freedom here, there's no place to escape to. This is the last stand on earth. And this idea that government is beholden to the people, that it has no other source of power except the sovereign people, is still the newest and the most unique idea in all the long history of man's relation to man. This is the issue of this election. Whether we believe in our capacity for self-government or whether we abandon the American Revolution and confess that a little intellectual elite in a far distant capital can plan our lives for us better than we can plan them ourselves. You and I are told increasingly we have to choose between a left or right. Well, I'd like to suggest there is no such thing as a left or right. There's only an up or down. Man's old age dream, the ultimate in individual freedom consistent with law and order, or down to the ant-heap of totalitarianism. And regardless of their sincerity, their humanitarian motives, those who would trade our freedom for security have embarked on this downward course. The full power of centralized government. This was the very thing the Founding Fathers sought to minimize. They knew that governments don't control things. A government can't control the economy without controlling people. And they know when a government sets out to do that, it must use force and coercion to achieve its purpose. We have so many people who can't see a fat man standing beside a thin one without coming to the conclusion the fat man got that way by taking advantage of the thin one. So they're going to solve all the problems of human misery through government and government planning. Well, now, if government planning and welfare had the answer, and they've had almost 30 years of it, shouldn't we expect government to read the score to us once in a while? Shouldn't they be telling us about the decline each year in the number of people needing help, the reduction in the need for public housing? But the reverse is true. Each year the need grows greater, the program grows greater. Yet any time you and I question the schemes of the do-gooders, we're denounced as being against their humanitarian goals. They say we're always against things, we're never for anything. Well, the trouble with our liberal friends is not that they're ignorant, it's just that they know so much that isn't so. I think we're for telling our senior citizens that no one in this country should be denied medical care because of a lack of funds. But I think we're against forcing all citizens, regardless of need, into a compulsory government program, especially when we have such examples as was announced last week when France admitted that their Medicare program is now bankrupt. They've come to the end of the road. I think we're for an international organization where the nations of the world can seek peace. But I think we're against subordinating American interests to an organization that has become so structurally unsound that today you can muster a 2/3 vote on the floor of the General Assembly among nations that represent less than 10% of the world's population. I think we're against the hypocrisy of assailing our allies because here and there they cling to a colony, while we engage in a conspiracy of silence and never open our mouths about the millions of people enslaved in the Soviet colonies in the satellite nations. I think we're for aiding our allies by sharing of our material blessings with those nations which share in our fundamental beliefs. But we're against doling out money government to government, creating bureaucracy, if not socialism, all over the world. No government ever voluntarily reduces itself in size. So government programs once launched never disappear. Actually, a government bureau is the nearest thing to eternal life we'll ever see on this earth. But as a former Democrat, I can tell you Norman Thomas isn't the only man who has drawn this parallel to socialism with the present administration. Because back in 1936, Mr. Democrat himself, Al Smith, a great American, came before the American people and charged that the leadership of his party was taking the party of Jefferson, Jackson, and Cleveland down the road under the banners of Marx, Lenin, and Stalin. And he walked away from his party and he never returned till the day he died. Because to this day, the leadership of that party has been taking that party, that honorable party, down the road in the image of the Labor Socialist Party of England. Those who would trade our freedom for the soup kitchen of the welfare state have told us they have a utopian solution of peace without victory. They call their policy accommodation. And they say if we'll only avoid any direct confrontation with the enemy, he'll forget his evil ways and learn to love us. All who oppose them are indicted as warmongers. They say we offer simple answers to complex problems. Well, perhaps there is a simple answer. Not an easy answer, but simple. If you and I have the courage to tell our elected officials that we want our national policy based on what we know in our hearts is morally right, we cannot buy our security, our freedom from the threat of the bomb, by committing an immorality so great as saying to 1 billion human beings now enslaved behind the Iron Curtain, give up your dreams of freedom, because to save our own skins, we're willing to make a deal with your slave masters. Alexander Hamilton said, a nation which can prefer disgrace to danger is prepared for a master and deserves one. Now let's set the record straight. There's no argument over the choice between peace and war. But there's only one guaranteed way you can have peace, and you can have it in the next second: surrender. Admittedly, there's a risk in any course we follow other than this, but every lesson of history tells us that the greater risk lies in appeasement. And this is the specter our well-meaning liberal friends refuse to face, that their policy of accommodation is appeasement. And it gives no choice between peace and war, only between fight or surrender. If we continue to accommodate, continue to back and retreat, eventually we have to face the final demand, the ultimatum. And what then? Well, Nikita Khrushchev has told his people he knows what our answer will be. He has told them that we're retreating under the pressure of the Cold War, and someday, when the time comes to deliver the final ultimatum, our surrender will be voluntary, because by that time, we will have been weakened from within spiritually, morally, and economically. He believes this because from our side he's heard voices pleading for peace at any price, or better red than dead. Or as one commentator put it, he'd rather live on his knees than die on his feet. And therein lies the road to war, because those voices don't speak for the rest of us. You and I know and do not believe that life is so dear and peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery. If nothing in life is worth dying for, when did this begin? Just in the face of this enemy? Or should Moses have told the children of Israel to live in slavery under the Pharaohs? Should Christ have refused the cross? Should the patriots at Concord Bridge have thrown down their guns and refused to fire the shot heard round the world? The martyrs of history were not fools. And our honored dead, who gave their lives to stop the advance of the Nazis, didn't die in vain. Where then is the road to peace? Well, it's a simple answer after all. You and I have the courage to say to our enemies, there is a price we will not pay. There is a point beyond which they must not advance. This is the meaning, in the phrase of Barry Goldwater, peace through strength. Winston Churchill said the destiny of man is not measured by material computations. When great forces are on the move in the world, we learn we're spirits, not animals. And he said there's something going on in time and space and beyond time and space, which, whether we like it or not, spells duty. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.
So, Danny, that just putting aside the ideas, the eloquence, the depth of history and thought and rootedness of his ideas in, going back all the way to Moses and Christ on the cross and the patriots at Concord. This was great oratory. This is how he became known as the great communicator. But as Reagan said in his farewell address when he left after presiding over the Reagan Revolution, he said, "I wasn't a great communicator. I was communicating great things." And I think both are true.
Amen to that. 100% true. I do, as our beloved friend Roger Noriega likes to say, I do miss Ronald Reagan nonetheless.
Yep.
Hey, we have a great guest. Mark has mentioned who he is, but Peter Schweizer is an investigative journalist. He's the author of 5 New York Times bestselling books. He's also the founder and president of the Government Accountability Institute, host of the Drill Down podcast, and he was previously a consultant to, I know someone else who worked here, the Office of Presidential Speechwriting in the White House for President George W. Bush. He's written Reagan's War, the epic story of his 40-year struggle and final triumph over communism. If you haven't read it, get it right now.
Here's our conversation. Well, Peter, welcome back to the podcast. It's so great to have you.
Great to be with you guys. Thanks for having me.
So you have become the great conservative chronicler, actually the great bipartisan chronicler of government corruption in this country. But before that, you had a prosperous career as a biographer of Ronald Reagan. Your book, Victory, was one of the best. It was the first book to come out and say communism didn't fall, it was pushed. And then Reagan's War, you came out and you actually had access to the Soviet archives, the Politburo archives, and you proved it from the inside. So these are my 2 favorite books on Ronald Reagan ever written. We've got the 60th anniversary of the Time for Choosing speech, which is the speech that really launched Ronald Reagan's political career, launched the conservative movement. Tell us a little bit about how it came about and its significance.
Yeah, I mean, Ronald Reagan, of course, a lot of people know that he was a Hollywood actor, and he'd been a Democrat for a lot of his adult life. And then he had this situation that developed in Hollywood where he was involved in the Screen Actors Guild. He became an anti-communist because he saw the sort of things that the Marxist left represented in terms of a threat to our individual freedoms. And he started moving to the right. And in the 1950s, he gave a lot of speeches for General Electric going around the country. And these were very, I think, deep speeches that talked about very important, broad themes. And he developed a national reputation, not just because he was an actor, but because he was a spokesman, as it were, for freedom and individualism. So in 1964, Barry Goldwater, of course, is the nominee for the Republicans. He's running against Lyndon Baines Johnson. Goldwater, of course, does not do well in 64. He gets trounced, to use the technical term. But one of the highlights of this is that before the election in November, a group of businessmen get together and buy airtime on television because they want somebody to go out and make the case for freedom, the affirmative case for freedom. And they pick Ronald Reagan to do it. So this is his opportunity to go before a national audience. And as a lot of historians would say, the speech was very well received. It put him on the map. But alas, it did not help Barry Goldwater beat LBJ in 1964.
So you are 100% right, obviously, that it was a wonderful speech, but the time wasn't right. And for me, what's so interesting is the foreshadowing in the speech. In fact, yes, their time Barry Goldwater's time had not come, it didn't come, it passed him by. But of course, Ronald Reagan's time comes 16 years later, which is amazing. And for me, and I know we want to get to this later and talk about the speech, but I want this question to infuse our discussion. I wonder whether actually Reaganism was the flash in the pan. If you go back and you read Matt Continetti's terrific book, The Right, and you look at what Barack Obama would love to call the arc of Republican history, from the 1920s to the 2020s, you would see the period of the ascendancy of the really wonderful, important ideas of Reaganism that were underpinned by the National Review and William F. Buckley as a blip. In fact, the J.D. Vances and the populists and the Tafts, they actually take up more time. I would love to hear what you think about that.
I think that's a very good question. And I think you're right. I mean, look, Reaganism, as it were, or what conservatives used to call fusionism, right? This is like merging anti-communism and classical liberalism and bringing them together, was a rarity. But I would also argue that it was also a reflection of the time. Right? I mean, if you look at, Reagan, who did Reagan most admire as an American president? It's debatable, but I would argue it was Calvin Coolidge. He favored Calvin Coolidge, and he loved Silent Cal. Calvin Coolidge was a president in the 1920s, and he was free trade oriented, he was free markets oriented, but he did not favor a strong posture overseas. Why was that? Because he didn't believe in it? No, because in the 1920s, it just was not a problem, or it was not an issue. So I think you are right in the sense that Reaganism represented a blip, but I also think Reaganism was a reflection of the time. And at that time when Reagan was running and became president, two large things were happening, and I would love you guys to jump in on this. One was, of course, the domestic malaise in the United States, the excessive regulation, the inflation that was plaguing us domestically, the general psychological profile of the country. So along comes Reagan, free markets and optimism to deal with that. The second historical thing going on is the Cold War and Soviet ascendancy. So I think you are right that Reaganism, in a sense, was a blip along conservatism. And I think there are certain tried and true conservative principles that we can debate and we can discuss. But I also think political movements are reflections of the time. What are the things that are actually going on in the world? And that explains, I think, partly why American conservatism adjusts and changes over time. It reflects, in part, the realities that they're operating under.
So, I mean, you make a hugely important point, right? And the leaders who best represent their time and who have the right answers to that moment, not just in America, but internationally, obviously, because Reagan talked hugely about the fight with communism. They are the truly great politicians. All right. But if that's the case, how did quote unquote conservatism end up here? Because I got to say, if I look at what I think at this moment defines the Republican Party, if you had asked me 10 years ago, who holds up these views, I would have told you it was a Democrat.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. There certainly are changes that are different from Reaganism, but I would also argue that's partly because of the political leadership we have, but I think it's also part of the realities that we face. So, for example, let's dive into one of the big controversial subjects right now, which is Ukraine. I absolutely support the Ukrainian government and think we should support the Ukrainian government. But I think we also have to look at a simple fact, and I think we have to put it in a context. As much as I would like to take Reaganism and apply it to Ukraine, the reality is when Ronald Reagan became president in 1981 and began his massive defense buildup, what was the debt to GDP ratio in the United States? It was 38%. What is it today? It's 123%. In other words, we are massively in debt. I still remember when Reagan was president, we passed $1 trillion in debt. We're now at 35 trillion. So, my point would be I disagree with those who say, we should not worry about Ukraine. But on the other hand, I am very sympathetic to the argument that a sort of full-throated United States is going to fund the entire operation in Ukraine. I don't think you can harken back to Reagan to make that argument, because I think even Reagan would recognize with the kind of debt that we have, we're going to have to make some priorities. We're going to have to pick those priorities, and pretending that the debt exists, I think, is not a way to deal with that issue. So part of it reflects the realities in which we face. Part of it, I think, reflects the changing nature of the Republican electorate, which is it is more blue collar, it is more working class than it was before. Part of that is out of political expediency. Part of that is, I think, because of social dynamic changes in the United States. So I agree with you. The conservative movement has changed. The leadership is different. Some of it is based on opportunism, and I think some of it is based on realities that we face that we did not face in the 1980s.
So I would push back on that just a little bit in the sense
Sure.
I don't disagree with your analysis of where our debt is, but the cost of a third world war would be a lot more expensive than helping Ukraine. If China invades Taiwan because of our weakness on the world stage, I mean, the whole point Reagan was actually the last president on whose watch America didn't get dragged into another war, and that was because of the Reagan defense buildup and his strong policies, right? I would argue that our time is actually much more similar to Reagan's than many would acknowledge. I mean, we've got runaway inflation. We've got Americans held hostage overseas. We've got a member of the first family doing business with foreign dictators, which you've documented. You've got a president begging OPEC to produce more oil. You've got Russia invading its neighbors, turmoil in the Middle East with Americans being killed by Iranians. And we seem to be on the verge of a new Cold War. And also, by the way, we're in a similar situation to we were in the post-Vietnam era, where we were coming out of some unpopular foreign wars, and we had to figure out a way to lead on the world stage without putting American troops everywhere and bearing all those costs. And so we came up with the Reagan Doctrine, which was to help these other countries fight their own wars of liberation and kill enemies. It seems like this is in many ways, we're in 1979 and on the cusp of 1980 right now. Why isn't Reaganism catching on more?
It's a good question, and I think you make a lot of points, Mark. I mean, my view on Ukraine would be we need to support them. We need to push Europe to do a lot more. Because again, I mean, $120 billion is not nothing. And given the realities that we face, it is a constraint. So look, I think when it comes to foreign policy, the United States general population is a little bit different to where it was when Reagan came into office. I think when Reagan came into office, we'd come out of Vietnam, and it was the lack of a muscular approach that was the problem. I do think that if you look at a lot of the polls, there is fatigue, particularly what happened with Iraq and elsewhere. And I think the question becomes not one extreme or the other. The sort of, complete isolationism is one thing. On the other hand, I think there has to be a recognition, and this is where, hopefully we can square the circle. There has to be some recognition that, the United States has to fix its fiscal problem. And we're going to have a very hard time doing that with the mood of the public if they perceive that so much of the money is going overseas.
Well, but the problem, of course, is that Ronald Reagan wanted to cut the welfare state, and the populists don't. I mean, one of the facts about being a populist party of the working class is what the Republican Party has been now. It's like, don't touch Social Security, which is what's going to bankrupt us in the end. All these giveaways, all this social spending. It's arguable that so far on the campaign trail, some analysis have shown that Trump, and sort of if you combine the tax giveaways plus spending, Trump actually wants to spend more than Kamala Harris does, at least in terms of what she's proposed. Now, of course, we know that if she gets into office, she's going to spend a heck of a lot more because she's not telling us what she wants to spend. I think in 2019, she proposed $46 trillion in spending. So that's what her real desire is. You're absolutely right in describing the fiscal crisis we're in, but we don't have a party for smaller government.
Correct. That is absolutely 100% correct. And the question is, in terms of thinking about a solution and moving the Republican Party back to its Reagan roots, I think is trying to analyze what that problem and that issue is. And I think part of the problem, having talked to people in Washington, as I know you do, in elective office, there's not a whole lot of profiles and courage in the Republican Party. They don't see cutting entitlements as a political winner. And we all saw the commercials when Paul Ryan and others campaigned on this, how they got crucified by the Democrats. And what Trump's solution to this is, I'm just going to double down on the Democrats, which is absolutely not the right approach to take.
Reagan talks about it in the Time for Choosing speech. He talks about Social Security, and pretty much describes the option that George W. Bush proposed in 2006 that got crushed.
Yeah, it got crushed by Democrats and by Republicans, as you remember, Mark. It's a terrible thing. And this is, I think, the thing that's so important about Reagan and about his speech and the political courage that Reagan showed. Because in 1980 and 1984, he staked out positions that were heavy lifts. They weren't necessarily popular things. He did it with an optimism. He did it with an engagement that gave people hope to the future. But he was also giving people some hard medicine to face. And that's, I think, one of the things that's lacking with the modern day Republican Party. It's that willingness to stand on principle and to firmly tell people this is where we need to go, even though we're going to get criticized and hurt for it. And that is not the Republican Party that we have today.
I just want to read back to us one of the earliest paragraphs of this speech, because it goes to exactly what the two of you are talking about, which is, okay, yes, people are going to be reluctant to spend money on foreign policy, even if it's paltry compared to what we spend on entitlements and everything else. But listen to this one. Okay. I have an uncomfortable feeling that this prosperity isn't something on which we can base our hopes for the future. No nation in history has ever survived a tax burden that reached a third of its national income. Today, 37 cents out of every dollar earned in this country is the tax collector's share. And yet our government continues to spend, you guys will both cry to hear this number, $17 million a day, more than the government takes in. Sometimes I feel like I'm spending personally more than $17 million a day. It gets worse. We haven't balanced our budget 28 out of the last 34 years. We've raised our debt limit 3 times in the last 12 months. And now our national debt is 1.5 times bigger than all the combined debts of all the nations in the world. We have $15 billion in gold in our treasury. We don't own an ounce. Foreign dollar claims are, make me cry, $27.3 billion. And we've now just announced that the dollar of 1939 will purchase 45 cents in total value. Other than the fact that some of those numbers are going to make you cry, and if we had just updated those numbers, couldn't someone have just given that same speech yesterday?
Yes.
Right. So what does this tell us about the ability of the United States political system to contend with the temptations of spending, to contend with the challenges of and the lure of taxation, right? I mean, I'd love to spend 37 cents out of every dollar on taxes. And what does this tell us about our future? This makes me feel like a pessimist.
Yeah, I mean, the numbers are very different than the numbers today, but you're exactly right, Danny. These are sort of the same foundational core issues, which are inflation, the size and scope of government, the level of taxation. And at least in 1964, in Reagan's time when he gave that speech, the federal government was financing most of the debt by issuing treasuries, right? And actually borrowing the money. Today, I just saw a chart the other day. I was at a conference, and I forget the exact number, but the amount of money that the Federal Reserve is now actually just printing to finance the debt, because there are very real concerns expressed by the Federal Reserve that we're going to issue treasuries and enough people may not buy them. And if enough people don't buy them, that's a really huge problem going down. So, yeah, the problem has gotten worse, and the political temptation that comes from people in elected office to spend money and to make promises is enormous. And I think one of the challenges with Trump's approach or with the new populist approach is that there's this sort of conflating of the free market and pro-business, right? Milton Friedman once said, I'm pro-free market, I'm not pro-business. What you're seeing with the populists is pro-business. And I think that's not good. That's not the direction we want to go.
I mean, that's right. And I do think I 100% agree with you. There are principles of free markets and capitalism, and let's call it honestly capitalism. And then there are principles of business that have very little to do with capitalism. And the longer a free
big
market
business and big government are like this. I mean,
Look,
they're in the same.
Yes. You know something, though, Mark? I mean, look, I agree. And Peter's certainly 10 times smarter than me on this topic. I never want to say that big business is bad. I don't think we're dealing with Rockefellers and Carnegies and people who are rapaciously exploiting the American people. The fact that
Mark Cuban.
Look, can I tell you something? The fact that NASA spends $200 billion for the same program that Elon Musk executed for a tenth the price seems to me to be a triumph of business, even if we don't like the people who are involved. So I think there's a lot to be said for free markets. I think there's a lot to be said for business, but the business of cronyism, the business of all of this that's not capitalism, that's not free markets. Cronyism is the opposite of all of these things. But that's not what I wanted to ask. That was just a comment.
Oh, that was just this. Oh, okay.
That was just me filibustering. The
Democrats are going to get rid of that, so you're okay.
We will never get rid of the filibuster on our podcast. I commit to you 100%. No, but Peter, if I can throw Mark under the bus one more time. Mark and I often have an argument in which I lay out, right, these trends that Ronald Reagan highlighted in 1964 that you correctly note. Damn, we hear a lot of this, only it's much worse now. And Mark always says, all this takes is a knight in shining armor, a Ronald Reagan to step out of the shadows and save us from all of this. I am not persuaded, and sorry, Mark, I'm a little bit simplifying what you say, but I am not persuaded.
We need another Ronald Reagan.
I am not persuaded that a Ronald Reagan could fix the problems that we have accumulated in these 60 years. What do you think?
Oh, it's a great question. I'm not sure that a Ronald Reagan could get elected right now, given where we are socially in terms of expectations from the government, especially since the
So true.
Republican Party has moved in the same direction. Remember, when Reagan won in 1980, America was in economically a very difficult place. I was 15 years old when Ronald Reagan got elected. And I remember interest rates were 17%, unemployment was going up. So when we complain about inflation that I think reached 9%, which is terrible, it was far more worse there. And I think people were more willing to go with somebody who wanted shock therapy. You see the same thing in Argentina, elected a libertarian economist. They never would have done that except for the fact that the situation was so desperate. So I think it would be hard for them to get elected, but I would say it's about leadership. And when you're in a crisis situation, I would agree with Mark. If you have the right leader in that circumstance, you can actually change the course of history. It takes hard work. It takes courage. You have to have Congress. You need to have people supporting you in Congress, and you can do it. But unfortunately, I don't think the crisis is bad enough for us to elect somebody who's going to provide shock therapy. That's why you have this competition between the parties as to who can, we're not going to tax this, we're not going to tax that. Look, I love the fact that taxes are lower. I do not like the fact that just certain types of income and certain people are getting tax cuts. I think that's just the reverse coin of giving handouts to people. I know tax cuts aren't handouts, but it's the same political gesture, and I don't like that.
So what you're saying is Kamala has to win so things can get worse before they get better.
Well, what was it? What was it? Vladimir Lenin said that as things got bad in Russia, the worse things get, the better things get. I'm not as cynical as Lenin, but no, I mean it's look. Here's the thing I will say about Trump. There is a component to Trump of the New York real estate guy, and so what do I mean by that? If I'm, Trump and I'm going to buy a $100 million building from Mark Thiessen in New York, I'm going to go and look at the building and I'm going to say, Mark, this building's crap. The foundation's cracked. The plumbing needs to be replaced. The edifice is all wrong. And you're looking at the same building saying, what are you talking about? It's kind of a negotiating strategy. My hope is, I don't know that this is true, my hope is that a lot of the discussion about tariffs, particularly as it relates to Mexico and other countries, is more based on trying to achieve leverage with foreign powers, that he really doesn't want the tariffs in place. I mean, he kind of did this, remember the Remain in Mexico policy that he adopted? How did he get it? He told the Mexican government, we're going to seize remittances. We're not going to allow them. So my hope is that some of the stuff we're hearing from him is really part of the negotiating approach that he takes. It's kind of that New York real estate way of getting to the bargaining table with as much leverage as possible. I hope I'm right.
I think you are right. And also, I think he needs to convince people that he's willing to do it. I mean, one of the things that you pointed out, as I remember in Reagan's war, when you went into the Soviet Politburo minutes, is that the Politburo actually believed all the propaganda that Reagan would launch a first strike. They were actually afraid that Ronald Reagan hated nuclear weapons, would never have contemplated launching a first strike, but the Democrats kept saying it. And so they believed it. And that was very valuable because the madman theory of international relations, he did the same thing with Russia when it came to Ukraine, with China when it came to Taiwan, with Iran when it came to after the Soleimani strike. So I think you're right from a tactical standpoint that a lot of it is negotiating. But to use that tactic, no one would believe it if Joe Biden said it.
Right.
They have to actually believe that he believes in tariffs and is willing to do it. And they have to believe that he's not afraid to use these weapons to strike Iran and strike Russia and strike China and all the rest of it. But I want to go back to foreign policy quickly because I want to inject some positive news on this, because I think that we oversell the isolationist sentiment in the country and in the Republican Party. So the Reagan Institute came out with a poll earlier this year, and I did a column on it. And on every single question they asked, from support for NATO to Ukraine to Israel, Taiwan, everything you could do, MAGA Republicans were more hawkish and less isolationist than establishment Republicans. I think 73% of MAGA, I'm just going through some of the numbers here, 73% of MAGA Republicans said the U.S. has a moral obligation to stand up for human rights and democracy whenever possible in international affairs, compared to 69% of non-MAGA. 69% of MAGA Republicans said they would support the U.S. responding with military force if a NATO ally was attacked, compared to 63% of non-MAGA. 70% said they agree that it's important for the United States that Ukraine win the war with Russia, compared to 64% of non-MAGA. 72% supermajority said they want Israel to continue military action in Gaza until it has removed the threat from Hamas, compared to just 65% of non-MAGA. And it goes on. Same thing with Taiwan, same thing with arms sales to Taiwan, increasing our military presence. It seems like the MAGA movement is actually more Reagan-esque or maybe Jacksonian than the establishment of the GOP, and that a lot of these loudmouths like Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene are loudmouths who don't really have that huge a constituency.
I would certainly agree with that. I think a lot of people, you mentioned a couple of them, and there are others, a lot of it's about drawing attention to themselves or trying to build up a media presence. They really don't have any sway within Congress. And again, I think we have to return to this question of Trump diplomacy. What is Trump diplomacy? And how much of is it tied up with sort of this negotiating approach that is designed to achieve some specific result? I know in the first term, Danny, both you and Mark, I'm sure, tracked this. There were lots of concerns in Europe that Trump was going to pull out of NATO. I think if you look at what Trump actually did, part of what you saw Trump saying about NATO and about European defense spending was an approach to get them to spend more on military approach. There were concerns that he wouldn't stand up to Russia. You know, he put Patriot missiles in Poland and was very supportive in lots of ways. So, you know, the point is, I think that you have to not necessarily look at things that Trump says. You have to look at the actual policies that he carries out. And of course, part of that is who are the people that are around him. And it's going to be very interesting to see who are the key national security advisors around him when he, you know, if he wins in November, which I think he probably is going to.
So after Nikki Haley lost the primary and Trump became the nominee, I wrote a column in the Post saying, I really want to support Donald Trump, but I want to support the Donald Trump that I supported in his first term. I want to support the Donald Trump that killed Qasem Soleimani, and the Donald Trump that bombed Syria twice over their use of chemical weapons, and the Donald Trump that gave Javelin missiles to the Ukrainians when the Biden and Obama-Biden administration wouldn't. The Donald Trump who launched a cyber attack on the troll farm in St. Petersburg and let the U.S. military wipe out a couple hundred Wagner fighters in Syria. That's the Trump I want to support, and I sent it to him, and he sent it back to me with a note, and it said, Mark, just remember, I'm always negotiating. Everything will work out best for USA and all. Donald Trump.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think that affirms your theory, which is that, you know, and I can say this because he sent it to me and suitable for framing. But you know, I think he sees this all as negotiation. He's a master negotiator in his view.
Yeah, and I think there's also a strange element of, you know, if you go back to 1950s foreign policy, the Eisenhower administration, you know, the sort of massive retaliation doctrine. I'm not saying that he is adopting that nuclear posture, but the whole element of that was to kind of be bombastic. And it was kind of to essentially, you know, threaten, look, if you cross this line, we might nuke you.
Fire and fury.
And of course, they weren't expecting that, but you kind of get that with Trump. And I do think there is this weird, I say weird because it's so unusual based on the relationships. I do think that some of these foreign leaders, I mean, they look at Trump and they're not sure what to expect. And maybe they even, the Herman Kahn, nobody wants to play a game of chicken with a madman, so they avoid conflict. I think that's part of what you get with Trump as well.
So I agree with you both. I think that there are a lot of things about Donald Trump that work extremely well. The problem for me is that they are tactical. When we talk about the Reagan speech, A Time for Choosing, and we talk about what it established going forward for the conservative movement, we were talking about a set of ideas. Now, you know, obviously, I live in think tank land. You know, people, so do you, Peter, so does Mark, but normal people don't wake up in the morning and say to themselves, ooh, what are my guiding principles? Peanut butter and jelly versus ham and cheese, right? That's not what normal people think about. On the other hand, their fate rests on these guiding principles. And All of the things we're talking about right now are, oh, well, let's just show him he's kind of crazy. Not, we need to win because the future of the free world rests on this. Or we need to win because nuclear proliferation is a disaster for us. Or we need to win because we can't spend ourselves into oblivion, or any of those things. That's what Reagan represented in 1964. Who is the person articulating those principled ideas today? Wait, there's a caveat here. Who has purchase in politics? And by the way, that can be on the left as well as the right.
Oh, man, you saved one of the toughest questions for the tail end of this, didn't you? That's a great question. I don't know if there's one single person I can point to. I mean, there are elements of it you see in different places. And part of it is, I think, because this notion of fusionism, kind of classical liberal libertarianism, with a sort of more hawkish foreign policy, it's hard to find those people. So, for example, there's some things I really like that Rand Paul says about the domestic economy and the need for deregulation and decentralization. I would not agree with him on foreign policy issues. So I don't think there's a single person. But look, I would raise this optimistic point. If you look at the first Trump term, in terms of what expectations were and in terms of what he actually delivered, I think it was a very successful administration in terms of policy. And as Reagan always said, policy is about people. When it comes to the foreign policy advisors, you're probably going to get people like Robert O'Brien or Mike Pompeo. That seems to be the sort of approach that I think Trump is going to take. The other thing I would say in terms of Trump that I think goes underappreciated, and this is an area where I would say Trump, a little bit better than Reagan, is Trump doesn't mind being unpopular. He doesn't mind being criticized. He doesn't mind being attacked. He doesn't mind the mainstream media telling him he's a horrible person. Ronald Reagan, probably in part because of Nancy Reagan, but didn't like that. He did not like, he was prepared to be tough when he needed to, but it was really hard for him to do it. The famous story, of course, was William French Smith, who was his personal attorney and then joined him in the Reagan administration. The story goes that in 1980, one of the maids that was working at Reagan's house, I think it was in Bel Air, was apparently stealing from him. But Reagan didn't have the heart to fire her, so he had William French Smith, his personal attorney, fire her. Donald Trump would have had no problem firing that person. And I would say that's a virtue, especially in the rough and tumble of politics, where we have all seen good, solid, fire-breathing conservatives go in, whether it's on the Supreme Court or in the Senate, and they kind of get seduced and they kind of fall into line because they want to be part of the in crowd. I think that's one of Trump's virtues. He doesn't mind if he's not in the in crowd as far as DC is concerned.
Well, it's interesting because you and I are both close to the Young America's Foundation, which owns the Reagan Ranch in Santa Barbara, and they have the Reagan Ranch Center downtown in Santa Barbara, as well as the ranch on the hill. Which is, by the way, all of our college students who are listening to this, go to YAF and visit the Reagan Ranch, because you will understand Ronald Reagan better after a day at the ranch than you would anywhere else. But Danny and I were actually there a couple of months ago. And one of the things, if you go to the Reagan Ranch Center, the museum that they've built there, is a 6-minute video of the Democrats just ripping the shellac off of Ronald Reagan and the media. So this idea that couldn't we go back to the days when we all got along, when Ronald Reagan was, oh shucks, and Tip O'Neill was what a great guy, and we'll just agree to disagree. They shellacked him for all these things. But I want the exit question I want to ask you. And I want to go back to the Time for Choosing speech. I want to read a segment of it the way Danny did, because this is the ending of it. And I think it gets to why you have this sort of, even though there's strong support in the party for a muscular foreign policy, there's the isolationists have a little bit more sway than they should. He's talking about the communist threat. And he says, "You and I do not have to believe that life is so dear and peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery. If nothing in life is worth dying for, when did this begin? Just in the face of this enemy? Or should Moses have told the children of Israel to live in slavery under the Pharaoh? Should Christ have refused the cross? Should the patriots at Concord Bridge have thrown down their guns and refused to fire the shot hurled round the world?" The martyrs of history were not fools, and our honored dead who gave their lives to stop the advance of the Nazis didn't die in vain. Where then is the road to the peace? Well, I'll give you an answer, and it's simple after all. You and I have to have the courage to say to our enemies, there's a price we will not pay. There's a point beyond which you will not advance. And he said, and you and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to the last step into 1,000 years of darkness. First of all, I just long for the days when presidents spoke that way. In both parties. But putting that aside, do Americans feel that we are in that kind of moment right now? We've got wars on 2 continents. And China has been arming itself. They unleashed a virus on our country that killed millions and millions of people. They're doing drills around Taiwan in the last few weeks. We could be on the cusp of World War III. Did the isolationists in the 1930s benefit from the fact that Americans really didn't feel the threat? And is there a threat out there that we're not feeling that is as serious as the threat of World War II and the Cold War?
That's a great question, and I agree with you, Mark. I mean, there are a lot of things you look around the world, and I think you even look in the United States, kind of things are on fire. Russia is a very serious threat, and we need to deal with that threat, and I'm hoping that our European allies maybe can pitch in a little bit more on that front. But for me, the bigger threat is China. I mean, Russia is a threat, no question about it. Russia is a descending threat. They have demographic problems, 160 million people. They have economic problems. China is the ascendant threat. And that, to me, I think is going to be the ultimate test of the next administration. Because when you look at what China's doing, this was my last book on blood money that came out earlier this year. I mean, when you look at fentanyl is a China problem. It is not a drug cartels problem. The Chinese are the senior partners. It's not a traditional drug problem. It is a poisoning. The vast majority of people that are dying of fentanyl poisoning aren't fentanyl addicts. They don't even know they're taking fentanyl. It's the leading cause of death in America for people under the age of 45. There's a series of other things that China is doing aggressively against the United States. And so I think the next
controlling 80% of our shipping cranes.
Yes, exactly. I mean, you go on and on and on. So I agree with you. It's Taiwan. But for people who think that threat is kind of far off and affecting this distant country, no, it's affecting the United States directly. And I would argue that we're already at war with China in a lot of respects. And the question is, the next administration has to stand up on that. And I think part of the question mark is, are the American people prepared to pay some economic costs? Because when it comes to dealing with China, part of the problem is going to be dealing with the issue of, we get all these cheap pharmaceuticals from China. We get so many of our renewable energy products from China. We get so many other critical goods, medical supplies from China. That's going to have to change. That is a major strategic vulnerability, and that's going to end up costing people. It's probably going to increase the cost of goods in various areas. And you need to prepare to do that, and you need to have a president who's prepared to do that. I think Trump is. I think that in the last administration, Trump met with Xi, and Xi said, we'll deal with fentanyl, we'll stop sending the precursors. Trump applauded him, and of course, Xi never did that. I think Trump believing that he could, by the force of personality, get Xi to do things, I think that myth Trump realizes he doesn't want to repeat it. So I think China, to me, is the biggest threat. That's not to minimize what's going on in the Middle East or what's going on in Russia. But if something is going to rise the concern and the ire of the American people, I think it's a threat from China, because it's not in a far-off, distant land like so many threats, seem to me in the eyes of ordinary Americans. It's something that actually tangibly affects us here in a very real and fundamental way.
Wow.
Exit question from me. We have discussed the challenges we face. We've discussed the different sort of topography of the political environment. We've discussed the different characters. We've discussed tactics versus strategy. Okay, I've got 2 guys in front of me on my screen who know about speech writing, who know about Ronald Reagan, who know about communicating with the American people, and who know about how our adversaries read that, whether at home or abroad. What is the title? What is the heart of the great seminal speech that somebody, not Donald Trump maybe, gives today that has the kind of impact that we're talking about now 60 years later? And I'll give you a sec to think about it too.
Well, I think the theme that we need to really emphasize is that America's worth fighting for. And the stakes are that high. I mean, Mark can do this better than I can. He's actually been a speechwriter in a major way. But I think that's
You worked
really
in the White House
theme.
speechwriting office too.
I do feel like that is ultimately the question. I mean, whether it's, in this campaign, the differences between the candidates as far as their stances on certain issues, but I also think the issue in the world. I mean, are we going to preserve America the way that we know it and that we love it? Or are we going to sort of succumb to, becoming more like China? And you could argue that, the grand bargain for the last 40 years has been let's trade and engage China and China will become more like us. I can make a case that we've actually become more like China. So I think is America worth fighting for? And saying that, yes, it is. That's, I think, the theme that we really need to enunciate. Somebody needs to enunciate and then lay out why and how we can fight.
I agree with Peter, and I would add that is a foreign policy speech. Because I think Congressman Mike Gallagher was on our podcast at one point and was talking about how, all this talk from the left about critical race theory and how America is a systemically racist country and, and all the rest of it, that's CCP propaganda. If they can convince us that this country is not good, then why would anyone give their life for it? Why would anyone give their hard-earned treasure to defend it? What we're seeing on the college campuses with the support for Hamas, what we're seeing on the college campuses with the destruction of the American idea and the destruction of an entire generation where patriotism is at the lowest levels it's been in decades, and people don't believe that this is a good country anymore. That's where the pushback has to be, because if we're not good, and we're not the force for good in the world, and we don't recognize that, then we can't do any of this. So I agree with Peter.
By the way, did both of you see the throwback to Kamala Harris's Indigenous Peoples Day speech from 2021? Yes. Right. If you want a country worth fighting for, maybe you shouldn't talk about how awful we are to build a country on the death, the rape, and the exploitation of others. You can be sensitive.
She believes in a future unburdened by what can be unburdened by what has been.
Yeah.
So all of that stuff can't stop us from one day becoming good if we just follow socialism.
Yeah. And by the way, let me just say, I mean, I think we need to rip the veneer off. A lot of people on the left, Kamala Harris would say the same thing. Oh, I say these things because I love my country. And you know what? I'm sorry. Could you imagine you're in a marriage and, you look to your wife and you say, you're obnoxious, you're ugly, you're a bigoted, you're overweight, but I really love you. I really love you. I mean, it's
absurd. I'm telling you because I love you so you can change.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think we just need to rip the veneer off, and we need to challenge them on that, because I'm sorry, that's just total bullshit. That is total bullshit that you love your country, but you think it's foundationally racist and everything. Why on earth would you love a country like that if you actually believe it? So I think we need to push back and challenge them on that. That should be in that great speech that Mark just started writing.
Right. That Mark, why I love this country. I can't wait to read it. Hey, Peter, as usual, you were amazing.
It's always fun, guys. Always fun. I enjoy it. I enjoy listening to the podcast. So thanks for having me on.
Well, we love your podcast as well, and we'll link to it in our Substack.
Take care.
Thanks, guys.
So, Danny, what'd you think?
So I love the idea at the end. I love the idea of a great and important speech laying out why America is worth fighting for and what there is to love about this country. I think pride in country is actually something that has been waning. I think kids don't feel proud. And look, if we look at the rates at which young men and women are joining the military, that's what we see, right? Yeah. They are not willing to fight for something. They don't see something to believe in. They don't see something to be proud of. Part of it is the yuck of the idea that Kamala Harris conveyed, that our country isn't a country to be proud of, that Michelle Obama conveyed when she said she was finally proud of our country when her husband was elected. A little self-serving. But it's deeper than that.
Not when we put a man on the moon, not when we defeated communism and brought down the Berlin Wall and won the Cold War without a shot being fired, when her husband was elected.
Yeah.
There you go. That's all you need to know. Look, I think that we need a resurgence of patriotism. And I think one of the things, we've had Walter Mead on this podcast before. We actually haven't had him on for a while. We should bring him back. But one of the things in his analysis of Jacksonian foreign policy is Jacksonians are not actually isolationists. They are willing to roar like a lion on the world stage if they think America is threatened. And I don't think there's a sense that America is threatened right now in the same way. People don't understand why Ukraine is important to us. They don't understand what's happening in the Middle East, why it could threaten us. I hope that we can build that understanding before it becomes obvious, because it became obvious in the 1930s eventually. It wasn't obvious when Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia, but it became obvious very quickly in 1939 when he invaded Poland. And so I hope we don't get
Did we
there.
give up when the Germans bombed Pearl Harbor?
Leave him alone. He's on a roll. Animal House ending. I love it.
But look, you're totally right. The magic is to recognize this and win before we need to fight. But in order to be willing to do that, you've got to recognize what's at stake. And I think, we forget. It's been 30 years since the end of the Cold War more. It's been 60 years since the principles were articulated by Ronald Reagan. And we need leaders who remind people of these absolutely critical things. Life actually could be a lot worse.
On that uplifting
People need to
note,
know it.
go vote, everybody.
All right, Mark, who's going to
Yes,
win?
I think it's going to be very close, but I think that the momentum is on Trump's side. I think it's been tightening, but it's been tightening in Trump's direction. I think the Nate Silver podcast put it at just over 50-50 for Trump, the most recent one that I'm looking when we're recording this. But if Trump wins Pennsylvania, he put it at something like 90%. So, everybody focus on Pennsylvania. We got to win Pennsylvania.
Well, if you agree with Mark, then absolutely, you got to win Pennsylvania. But Mark's absolutely right. We all look at Nate Silver, and it was interesting to me that Nate, today, when we're recording this, finally admitted, yep, Trump's got the momentum. Still a tight race, but
gonna be
very
fascinating.
very interesting. All the more reason for you to start thinking about how to write that great speech, Mark. Hey, everybody, take care.
See you next week.
Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. You can get in touch with the show by emailing us at whatthehell@aei.org.
Or you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at @dpletka.
And I'm at Mark Thiessen. That's Mark with a C.
Please rate and review the podcast. If you like the show, please subscribe, share it, comment on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this.
Thanks for listening.